There are moments in life that begin like any other. A front door swings open, a pair of sneakers hit the pavement, the sky is still bright. And then, without warning, everything changes, not gradually, not with signs that could have been read in time, just suddenly, completely, and forever. August 2nd, 2016. It was a Tuesday evening in East New York, Brooklyn. The temperature was warm, the sun still hanging in the sky, and 30-year-old Karina Vetrano was getting ready for a run. This was not unusual. Running was part of who she was. Running was part of who she was. A routine she had built into the rhythm of her days, something she returned to the way others returned to music or conversation. The park she chose, Spring Creek, sat just a few blocks from the home she shared with her family. 2 square miles of nature reserve tucked into the edge of the borough, with winding trails, thick weeds reaching up to 10 feet high, and overgrown corridors that blocked any clear line of sight. It was familiar ground, and it was remote in the way that certain places are remote even inside a city. Her father, Phil, a retired firefighter, usually ran those trails alongside her. That afternoon, he stayed behind. A back injury kept him home. He told her he was uneasy about her going alone, that the isolation of the area made him uncomfortable. She told him not to worry. She would be fine. Before she walked out, she paused to take a selfie near her mother, Kathy, who was passing through the background. Then she left. About 45 minutes passed, then another 45, then an hour beyond that. Phil began calling her phone. No answer. Something shifted in him, a feeling he later described as a sudden and certain knowledge that something had gone wrong. He reached out to a childhood friend who worked with the New York City Police Department. A patrol car was sent to the area. When officers could not locate her, the search expanded. Units from the 106th Precinct moved through the dense reeds with machetes, cutting through growth that towered over their heads. The evening darkened around them. At 10:30 that night, officers heard a man screaming somewhere in the weeds. They ran toward the sound. It was Phil. It was Phil. He had found his daughter. She was lying face down on the ground, roughly 15 feet from the running trail, in a marshy stretch of land that residents had long flagged as a security concern. Officers had to physically pull him away from her body. He kept saying he needed to take her home. What investigators found at that scene stayed with them. Karina had bruising across her face, broken teeth, abrasions on her legs. Her clothing had been pulled down. The evidence indicated a sexual assault. Her hand was still grasping a fistful of grass, suggesting she had been dragged. The outline of a hand was visible on her neck. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been strangled to death. But what stood out to everyone who worked that scene was this. She had fought back, fiercely, without hesitation, with everything she had. She had bitten her attacker hard enough to break her own teeth. That detail, quiet and devastating, said everything about who Karina Vetrano was. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall. She held a master's degree from St. John's University. She worked in Manhattan as a speech pathologist, supporting children with disabilities, a job that required patience, attentiveness, and care. She was also a club promoter on weekends, a woman who filled every hour of her life with purpose. Her friend Erica described her as a little firecracker, someone whose laugh filled whatever room she was standing in. Her father said she was everything a parent could hope for. She lived, he said, as if she already knew time was short. The investigation began immediately and broadly. Detectives interviewed landscapers and home improvement workers across Howard Beach. Dozens of officers fanned through the surrounding neighborhoods. A tractor with an industrial mower was brought to the crime scene. Because the land was federally owned, the FBI was brought in to assist, deploying drones over the area to search for additional evidence. The reward fund climbed quickly, reaching more than $45,000 through a combination of police contributions, mayoral funding, and a GoFundMe campaign that drew support from thousands. Early in the investigation, a man named Paul came to the attention of detectives. He was a coworker of Karina's from the nightclub where she promoted events on weekends. Friends said he had made unwanted advances toward her, that he had grown aggressive when she rejected him, and that his behavior had crossed into something that resembled stalking. But after investigators looked into his movements on the day of the murder, they determined he had been at work at the time. The early theory was forming. This appeared to be a random attack. A stranger, someone who had seen her on the trail and made a choice. That kind of case is among the most difficult to solve because there is no relationship to trace, no argument to reconstruct, no prior contact to locate. The only thing left to follow was the physical evidence, and the strongest piece of that evidence was a DNA profile developed from material found under Karina's fingernails and on her mobile phone, which had been discovered several feet from her body. The rape kit had not yielded usable DNA, but the profile from the fingernails was clean, complete, and ready to be compared. It was entered into the national database. No match came back. Weeks passed. The case gained public attention. At Karina's funeral on August 6th, an estimated 400 people gathered, including members of the New York City Fire Department who came to honor the daughter of one of their own. Phil spoke at the eulogy. He said she had lived more in 30 years than most people live in a lifetime. Her mother stood outside the family home days later and addressed the person responsible directly, promising with absolute certainty that justice would come and that the weight of what had been done would follow him beyond this life. Phil threw himself into the investigation the way he had thrown himself into finding her that night. He could not stop. He said that stopping would be the moment when the bottom dropped out. So he kept going. He pushed for a technique called familial DNA searching, a method that looks not for an exact match in the database, but for a close enough match to suggest a biological relative. It was being used in 9 states at the time, but not in New York. He started a petition. He talked to anyone who would listen. He believed it could break the case open. By the end of August, a composite sketch had been released. A Verizon employee who had been working in the park the day of the murder came forward to say he had seen a man who seemed out of place. The man was wearing a wool cap on a day when the temperature was well into the summer heat. A sketch was created and made public. Almost immediately, a tip came in from a former senior officer who is now working as head of security at a Brooklyn apartment building. He said one of the tenants appeared to match the sketch. His name was Kevin. When police went to the building, he initially refused to open his door. Officers waited. When he finally left the residence, he acknowledged the resemblance himself. He was brought in for questioning. He declined to provide a DNA sample. That refusal caught everyone's attention. But investigators later recovered a sample from a discarded water bottle. The DNA did not match. Kevin was eliminated. The investigation returned to the beginning. January 2017. 6 months had passed. Lieutenant John Russo, one of the detectives who had been present the night Karina was found, was reviewing the case when a memory surfaced. It was something from May of 2016, a few months before the murder. He had been on his own street in Howard Beach when he noticed a man walking away from him. It was approximately 80 degrees outside. The man was wearing a long-sleeve tracksuit with a hoodie pulled up over his head. That detail had stayed with Russo without him fully knowing why. The man had appeared to be observing nearby homes, moving in a way that did not quite fit the environment. Russo had called it in at the time, but the man was gone before officers arrived. The following day, neighbors had reported similar behavior from a man in a black and white tracksuit trespassing across several properties. Russo had eventually encountered him directly and asked his name. The young man had said his name was Chanel Lewis. Russo had thought that was the end of it. Then, sitting with the cold case in January 2017, that name came back to him. He started looking into Lewis more carefully. He had no criminal record, but there were several summonses from the Brooklyn side of Spring Creek Park, directly across from the area where Karina had been murdered. When Russo called Chief Boyce, something in the sound of his voice communicated what words had not yet fully said. An instinct had landed somewhere important. Detectives approached Chanel Lewis. He was 20 years old. He told them he knew the area well, that he walked the trails often, alone, with music in his ears to clear his head. He described himself as a loner with few friends. He cooperated. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample. Investigators also visited his former high school, where records revealed a difficult history. During his school years, he had been documented making threats toward female classmates. He had been transported twice to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Reports described him as someone who had been repeatedly bullied, isolated, and struggling. Several former classmates said he had never been violent toward them directly. Others described incidents that painted a more complicated picture. A diagnostic label mentioned in one news outlet was never independently confirmed. What mattered most to the investigation was something his own father provided without realizing what it meant. His father, trying to defend his son, mentioned that Chanel had been taken to the hospital the day after the murder for an injured hand. He said Chanel had been involved in an altercation, but he could not say exactly with whom. Detectives tracked down the physician who had treated him. The doctor described removing a foreign object from Chanel's hand. The DNA sample Chanel had voluntarily given now came back with a result. It matched the profile developed from the crime scene. The foreign object in his hand was later believed to be a fragment of Karina's tooth, broken off when she bit him during the attack. On February 5th, 2017, Chanel Lewis was brought in and the recording began. What followed, captured on videotape, was a detailed account. He placed himself at Spring Creek Park on the evening of August 2nd. He said he had been walking, listening to music. He said a girl was jogging. He said one thing led to another. He described grabbing her, hitting her in the face and the mouth. He said the entire encounter lasted about 5 minutes. He said he dragged her roughly 10 feet into the grass. When asked why, he talked about a neighbor near his former address who played loud music and brought groups of people around, someone who made him feel unsafe in his own space. He said that anger had been sitting inside him, and that when Karina ran past him on that trail, he took it out on her. He was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, held without bail. After his arrest, Phil Vetrano turned back to the GoFundMe funds that had been raised by the community. He felt those who had donated should have a say in what happened to the money. He announced later that nearly $300,000 had been distributed, including a contribution to Archbishop Malloy High School to establish a scholarship in Karina's name. A grand jury indicted Lewis on 13 counts, including murder and sexual abuse. He faced life in prison without parole. He entered a plea of not guilty. His family spoke outside the courthouse and said they were certain the wrong person had been arrested. His father described his son as wonderful, gentle, unable to commit what had been described. His mother said her son had mental health needs and was not a criminal. Those words settled into the air around a case that was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The first trial began in November 2018. The prosecution described Lewis as isolated, unemployed, and frequently angry. They argued that he had acted on that anger in a random attack, that Karina had done nothing to provoke what happened, that she had simply been running. The DNA evidence, they said, was overwhelming. The confession, recorded on video, was damning. Defense attorneys from the Legal Aid Society pushed back hard. They argued the confession had been coerced after hours of questioning. They questioned the reliability of the DNA evidence, noting that the crime scene had been accessed by multiple people, including Karina's father. They said their client was innocent and that the investigation had been steered toward a conclusion rather than allowed to develop organically. 7 days of testimony, then deliberations. Jurors spent more than an hour reviewing the second videotaped confession. They requested readbacks of 74 pages of testimony from the DNA expert. They asked to review the autopsy photographs. After a day and a half, 5 jurors said they could not reach a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. A letter was sent to the judge. They had exhausted every avenue. The deadlock held. The judge declared a mistrial. Karina's parents left the courthouse in silence. Lewis's attorneys spoke about the complexity of the evidence. For the Vetrano family, the word mistrial meant going back. Sitting through it again, carrying the weight of it forward into another year. The prosecution came to the retrial with new evidence. Among the additions was a detailed record of Chanel Lewis's online search history from the period before his arrest. The searches included queries about indictments, plea deals, prosecution procedures, and news coverage of Karina's murder specifically. The retrial began in March 2019. Phil Vetrano returned to the stand. At one point, he dropped to his knees in front of the jury as he described finding his daughter. The defense maintained their position. The confession was coerced. The DNA was unreliable. Their client was innocent. Then, the day before deliberations were set to begin, an anonymous letter arrived. Addressed to the defense, it claimed to be from an NYPD officer with concerns about the investigation. The letter alleged that in early strategy meetings, a high-ranking officer had described the department as looking for, in direct terms, two white men from Howard Beach. It also alleged that the DNA swab from Lewis had not come through focused investigative reasoning, but through a broad dragnet that involved swabbing more than 360 Black men across Howard Beach and surrounding areas. The defense sought a hearing. They called it a fundamental violation. The prosecution called the letter a fabrication designed to derail the trial. The judge denied the request for a hearing. Deliberations began April 1st, 2019. The jury returned. Chanel Lewis was found guilty of murder in the first degree. As he was led from the courtroom, he raised his cuffed hands in a farewell toward his family. Then came a new delay. Before sentencing could proceed, a claim emerged that juror misconduct had occurred during deliberations. One juror was alleged to have stated from the start of the trial that her mind was already made up. Another was said to have introduced personal experience with sexual violence into deliberations to explain the absence of DNA in certain parts of the evidence, telling others that she knew better and that they should take her word. A third juror was alleged to have compared injuries from an unrelated case she had previously served on as a juror to injuries in this case. The defense argued these actions had denied their client a fair deliberative process. The prosecution responded by saying jurors drawing on personal experience and forming opinions in response to graphic testimony did not constitute misconduct. The judge reviewed all sworn affidavits from the jurors and ultimately rejected the misconduct claims. Sentencing took place on April 23, 2019. Karina's parents stood and spoke. Her mother brought a pair of shoes into the courtroom. The shoes Karina had worn on August 2nd, the morning before she went out for her run. She held them up and described her daughter as a giant in a small body, a warrior, a queen. She spoke about what had been taken, not just a life, but every ordinary moment that would never come. Every birthday, every Christmas, every unremarkable Tuesday that had once been worth looking forward to. She said that only her belief in heaven kept her moving, because stopping meant she might not be allowed in when the time came to see her daughter again. Phil addressed Lewis directly. He said Karina had a message for him, that if he stood up and asked for her forgiveness, she would give it. He made clear those were not his words. He said he would never forgive him. Lewis said 3 things before sentencing was imposed. He said he was innocent. He said he was sorry for the family's loss. And he said he did not do this. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with an additional 32 years added for the second-degree murder and sex abuse charges. He told Lewis that in the years ahead, the world would move on, followers of the case would forget, and he would remain alone in a cage. He called it a lose-lose situation for both families and named it what it was. It's a parent's worst nightmare. A child leaves for a run and does not come home. And outside the courthouse, protesters gathered. Some shut down Queens Boulevard. A petition with 40,000 signatures called for the case to be referred to the Conviction Integrity Unit. Lewis's legal team began working on an appeal. The questions that had been raised about the investigation, the racial composition of the DNA dragnet, the anonymous letter, the missed early leads, did not vanish with the verdict. They remained, sitting just outside the formal record of the case, in the space where public uncertainty tends to live long after a courtroom door closes. In June 2017, before the trials began, New York State had approved the use of familial DNA searching in murder and rape cases, the very tool Phil had fought for. It came too late to matter in this case, but it would matter in others. The case involving Vanessa Marcotte, the young woman whose murder in Massachusetts had briefly raised questions about a possible connection to Karina's death, was resolved separately. In April 2017, Angelo Colin Ortiz was arrested after DNA evidence linked him to that case. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison, ineligible for parole until 2067. Spring Creek Park still exists in East New York. The trails are still there. The weeds grew back, and in a corner of that park near the place where Phil found his daughter, there is a memorial. Stones arranged in the shape of a butterfly, an angel figure, candles. Phil goes there every morning. He has said it is the only place where he feels any sense of control. He knows it might seem strange, returning to the exact spot where the worst moment of his life happened. But he goes anyway. He sits, he talks to her, and he says she talks back in the way that people who are gone continue to speak to those who love them best, in small sounds and in the feeling that something is still present when the world gets quiet enough to listen. Karina Vetrano was a daughter and a friend. She was a woman who worked with children who needed help finding their voice. She was someone who ran because it made her feel strong and free. She stepped out of her front door on a summer evening to do something she had done 100 times before. She did not come home. That gap between the ordinary and the irreversible is where this story lives. And it is where her family continues to live too, carrying everything she was into every day that she is not.